Spinach is one of the first vegetables to come out of the spring garden. Unfortunately, you may look like you have so much spinach or so many greens that you're never going to be able to use them all. Canning is one thing that's going to help push them down into a much smaller quantity, however. It takes a lot of fresh greens to can very many jars of food. It takes 28 pounds of spinach to can about 7-quart jars, so that you're going to have a lot of spinach in order to start. It also takes a lot of washing because spinach and greens grow close to the ground. They have a lot of crooks and crannies, so you need to put them in clear water, wash them well, move them around with your hands, and then lift them out of the water. Put them into fresh water and keep repeating that until you no longer get any grit or dirt coming out. You also need to try and can your spinach the day that you harvest it, so that you may be canning in smaller quantities rather than saving it up for one large batch, because it does bruise and damage fairly easily, and it keeps a fairly short time in the refrigerator at the quality that you want in order to put it into either the freezer or the canner. Now, when you get the spinach clean, you'll want to remove any large ribs or tough parts, also any damaged parts. Just remove them and throw them away. You may want to tear it up. You may want to cut it a little bit. You can can spinach either whole leaf or cut. Now, in order to compress this enough to get it in the jars, because if we just put it like this, by the time we put hot water in there and actually can it, we're going to have very little actual spinach in there. We're going to blanch it or hot pack it or heat it up a little bit, cook it shortly so that we'll be able to squeeze out a lot of the air, soften it up, and be able to pack a lot more efficiently in our jar. Blanching and draining the spinach is going to be relatively easy if you have a pot like this, which is basically a spaghetti pot for cooking pasta, where you can hold it over the hot water and then just pull it out and it will drain very easily. You should do about 1 pound at a time, otherwise it gets too crowded in there for it to steam well, and 3 to 5 minutes. It will depend, just until it's well wilted. It depends a little bit on the quality of the spinach, the variety of spinach, and so on. Once the spinach is wilted well, you can see how much less you have than what you started with. Now, at this point, we're ready to fill our jars. Because you're going to be working with only 1 pound at a time, and it's going to take probably over 1 pound in many cases to fill a jar, you're going to have to do this several times, so it's going to take you a bit of time. Now, it is going to be something that you want to pack these as warm as possible and as hot as possible and as quickly as possible, but you're going to fill them with hot water later on. Now, notice the difference in the color here. We have a very bright color, and that will change as they are processed in the pressure canner, because we'll be retaining the acids around them and so on, and that will cause the color to change. Now, one of the things a lot of people do with spinach when they can it is they try to pack it too tightly. We want to pack it relatively loosely. If you pack it too tightly, then there's not going to be enough space around there for the air for the liquid to move and for the heat to penetrate to the center of the jar within the processing time that's allotted. We want to fill these up so that we can have 1 inch of head space without compressing it too tightly, and we are going to cover the top of it with hot water. Okay, now if you wanted to have salt, you'd add 1/4 teaspoon of salt to a pint jar, or 1/2 teaspoon of salt to a quart jar. You should use canning salt, or salt made specifically for canning and pickling, rather than just table salt, which may cause it to cloud. Now, we are going to fill this with hot water, and we may need to adjust the liquid levels or the food levels after we get it filled up a little bit here. The 1-inch line on the jar is this line right here, and that's where our target will be to fill this up. Now, it's a good idea to get a plastic knife or an official bubble popper, but a plastic knife that you get from the grocery store or the fast food place works equally well to remove all the air bubbles. We want to get as much air out as we can at this point so that we won't have to evacuate the air later on in the pressure canner. And there'll be less chance then of the liquid coming out of the jar. Okay, you need to get down to eye level to check on the fill. Then you take a paper towel and you get it a little bit damp in clean water, and you wipe the rim to make sure that there's no salt or food left on here, which may prevent a seal. At that point, we'll take and get our lid out of hot water. This has been sitting in hot water for about 3 minutes. You don't need to dry it off, and then you screw the band on so that it's firmly tight. You don't want to screw it too tightly because that would prevent the air from coming out, and you'll end up getting a wavy top or a washboard surface. This then is going to be ready for the pressure canner. Now, if we were doing several jars, of course, we would proceed with those before we got it in the pressure canner. This one we can go ahead and lower into the pressure canner. We then bring the heat up on the pressure canner so that we get steam evacuating from the lid, from the vent pipe. We let the steam evacuate for 10 minutes. Then we put on the weighted gauge. Because I'm using a weighted gauge, I'm going to process it at 15 pounds pressure because Stillwater, Oklahoma is over 1,000 feet in altitude. So we'll process it at 15 pounds pressure for 70 minutes. If you were using a dial gauge, depending on what your altitude is, you'll need to check, but it will be probably at 11 pounds pressure, again for 70 minutes. But you do need to check to see what your altitude is so that you know exactly how many pounds of pressure or what weight of gauge you need to be using. This does go for 70 minutes, as I mentioned. Then you let the canner cool on its own before you remove the lid of the canner. Once that's done after the 70 minutes, you set that in a place where it can sit without being in the air conditioning or with a fan blowing on it, on a paper towel so that there's no direct contact with anything extremely cold. Once it's set there for 12 hours, somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, you need to check the lid. You do that by tapping on it with a spoon or a fork or pressing on the top of it. If there's no movement on that lid, then you can go ahead, remove the screw band at that point in time, and this is then ready to wash up, label, and store away for next winter.